The United States left Afghanistan in August of 2021. No one knew that the Taliban would quickly recapture every province and take control of the country as fast as they did. And they did without resistance. What did this mean? Well, it basically meant that the United States 20-year war, which is the longest war in U.S. history in Afghanistan, was an utter failure of magnificent proportions. And today I want to talk about those failures and what has led to the rise of extremist groups like the Taliban, Al Qaeda, and Islamic State Khorasan. And the war on women that the Taliban have continued to enforce. And NPR came out with an article today regarding about women's beauty salons in Afghanistan. As you can see, it is Associated Press. Taliban are banning women's beauty salons in Afghanistan, a government spokesman said Tuesday. It's the latest curb on the rights and freedoms of Afghan women and girls following edicts barring them from education, public spaces, and most forms of employment. A spokesman for the Taliban-run Virtue and Vice Ministry. Virtue and Vice Ministry. What the hell do these people know about virtue and vice? Mohammed Sadiq Akif Mahajar didn't give details of the ban. He only confirmed the contents of a letter circulating on social media. Now, remember what the Taliban said in 2021, that they wouldn't basically, become the Taliban of 96. Well, here we are. The ministry issued later, dated June 24th, said it conveys a verbal order from the supreme leader, Hibatullah Akhundzada. The ban targets the capital, Kabul, and all provinces, and gives salons throughout the country a month's notice to wind down their business. It also destroys the business of Afghanistan economy, which they're trying to build, by the way. I mean, these people are backwards. After that period, they must close and submit a report about their closure. The letter doesn't give reasons for the ban. The release comes days later after Akhundzada claimed that his government has taken necessary steps for the betterment of women's lives in Afghanistan. How is that betterment of women's lives? Well, according to their interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah, these are Hazaras. They don't really adhere to the Quran. Drew criticism from human and women's rights defenders on social media. The United Nations on Tuesday also said it would engage with the authorities in Afghanistan to get the ban on beauty salons reversed. Yeah, right. The UN mission in Afghanistan, also known as UNAMA, took to Twitter, urging the Taliban to halt the edict. And, we should give it its context about what has led to this point. And when you had a 20-year war in Afghanistan with the United States and coalition partners, and that was in response to the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, you had an operation called Operation Jawbreaker, which was led by the CIA Special Activities Division and U.S. Special Forces in eliminating Al Qaeda under Osama bin Laden and the Taliban. A capture or kill notice. The CIA wanted to just outright kill bin Laden. At the time, it seemed like a good idea, but no one knew at that time that this war would be the longest war in U.S. history. Why? Because Afghanistan is a very huge country. There's a lot of major league power players surrounding this country. China, for being one. India, Pakistan, even Russia. It's not too far. So a lot of countries could basically influence this country and become a staging ground for NGOs or for opium product. Afghanistan is rich in opium. It's the biggest, largest producer of opium in the world. And this is a huge problem in Afghanistan because it basically is the driving force for covert actions, because covert actions paid by drug money. And I think when you have a country that is so turbulent, under so much internal fractalization, because Afghans are notably indifferent to most of the world, but they are very invested in their politics and into the traditions, Pashtunwali traditions that even predate Islam. And these are very held dear to the Afghan community, which leads to sectarian violence in between. And it's usually after a war, as we saw with the Soviets leaving Afghanistan in 1989, that we saw two civil wars in the country follow right after, which led to even more deaths than the 10-year war that the Soviets. When the United States became involved with the country, it basically turned the country into itself, in that Afghans would be fighting Afghans. You had Northern Alliance against Taliban. You had Taliban associates like Taliban and Deobandi groups that basically were switching sides all the time, because if the money was right, one thing about Afghans is that if the money was right and one could prosper, warlords would switch sides with each other. This led to, non-negotiating properties. Like there wouldn't be an end to a war. It's always a conflict, and secrets would be shared within one another. So this is what led to the conflict being for so long and so heated so long. And opium production in the country basically fuels for groups like drug lords in the country, Afghan drug lords, who are some of the most powerful, sometimes even more powerful than Taliban in Afghanistan. But when you have an ulema, huge Taliban ulema community of groups that are even affiliated with Taliban, it basically comes into conflict with even U.S. interests who are there. Why did the United States take over the opium trade in Afghanistan? Well, of course, it pays for CIA-led covert wars throughout the world. The CIA can't go to Congress and basically say, "Hey, we need $30 million because we're about to overthrow a dictator somewhere in Ukraine or in Afghanistan or Iraq," right? It goes through the drug trade. And the drug trade in Afghanistan is rich. And so this actually helps the groups like the Taliban, these drug lords in Afghanistan, to do business with CIA affiliates. And so when the United States left in August of 2021, the NATO-backed Islamic Republic of Afghanistan collapsed almost immediately. That just shows you that for 20 years, the United States basically were not very productive in rebuilding Afghanistan. I mean, I can't really blame the United States wholly on this, because Afghanistan, geez, what can I say about this? When you have a police officials who don't know anything about democracy, even with the communist-backed regimes of Hafizullah Amin or Nur Muhammad Taraki in the 70s and 80s, Afghanistan hasn't seen democracy probably in about 80 years, generation. And when you have traditions, old age traditions that even predate Islam, you can't force a democracy on a people that see it as a foreign identity or ideology. And when you have very, very few commerce and trade in the country, this actually doesn't help with the economy in the country either. And when you have a hostile nation, which are led by various factors happening, you basically have turmoil within, corruption. And so when the United States trained the Afghan army and the Afghan police on how to conduct judicial, having a system based on judicial properties, according to the West, it's not going to be understood in a week or a month. This is going to take years. And remember, you're trying to change these people's culture. You can't do it. And this is something the United States basically has a problem with. They think that democracy should be on every facet of the world. You can't force democracy on people that don't even know what democracy means. Can't change a culture overnight. This is why the United States failed in Iraq. It's why they failed in Afghanistan. Now, when the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan collapsed, the Taliban controlled the whole city, except for the Kabul International Airport, Hamid Karzai Airport. They named it after him. And the hostilities between the leftovers and the Afghan municipal police and the army ceased, and the Taliban assisted in the evacuation of any U.S. officials and U.S. people. And I think this was actually a backdoor deal that the United States made under the Biden administration. Well, it started under the Trump administration, but it ended with the Biden administration. And that the deal was, we'll leave you alone, but you make sure we get out the country safely and no American gets killed. We don't care about the interpreters. We don't care about the doctors or the nurses, university professors, or even the citizens. Get our people out first. Do whatever you want after that. That's what it seemed like here. And the Taliban did. Now, Taliban could have shot down these, Boeing C-17 planes that were evacuating Americans out of the country. And they, the United States even gave a date on when to leave. And I think it was like August 11th to the 13th, because they finally left at the August 13th to the end of the month, the 31st or 30th. So they had a 2.5 week window where the Taliban could have, basically sent martyrdom operatives to, run into a plane and blow up the plane. Or they could have just rushed these American planes with their military vehicles, which, by the way, a lot of U.S. weapons and military-grade vehicles were left behind on purpose. The United States won't tell you that. We'll get into that in a minute. So they had a 2.5 week window where the United States safely evacuated. And even though the coalition countries, began small evacuation efforts in the months leading up to August of 2021, such as Great Britain, the collapse of the government occurred sooner than, say, what the CIA told the State Department or the principals at the meetings and National Security Council meetings. It happened sooner because the Afghans were ill-equipped to deal with the Taliban. And the Taliban, much like Islamic State in Iraq, when they took over the capital in Baghdad, just like that, without resistance against a formidable army. Same thing happened here. Taliban took control of a number of provinces, but not the majority. But when they took over Kabul, that was it. Every other province fell after that. and it was like dominoes. So what does that say? Well, it says the ineptitude of the Afghans in the civil sector. It also talked about the ignorance on U.S. and coalition partners, that you had 20 years to restructure the country or help in a restructured country. And by the way, you helped to destroy the country. You have a right to help reconstruct the country, but they didn't do that in Iraq, did they? So Afghanistan was a different type of war than Iraq. Nevertheless, I think there was about 80,000 people that were evacuated in that 2.5-week window. And it was over, if we go by, and I'll read the CIA chief and Taliban leader meet as Taliban demand, and this is an article by the NPR in February 2023. In total, there was 122,000 people that were airlifted, and the evacuation was complete on August 30th, one day before a deadline agreed upon by the Taliban. So when the United States left, it basically was an open door, because the Taliban basically promised the world will change. We're not like the Taliban of 96 under Mohammed Mullah Omar. We're not the Taliban of 2001 or 2005. No, we're different. We're about human rights. As soon as they said that, one by one, they knocked down women's rights. No universities, no TV, no music on the radio. These are haram. According to them, haram is sinful. Then it became no women in universities. Right back to when the Taliban took over the country in Kabul in 96, I'm sorry. And this is why the Northern Alliance fought them, and why the United States didn't give military aid to the Northern Alliance or to the Uzbeks and Tajiks who are fighting against the Taliban and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's Hizb-e-Islami army. That's because the Hizb-e-Islami and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar were CIA affiliated. Because when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, most of the CIA money under the Operation Cyclone program went to this ghoul, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who used to throw acid at women's faces without wearing a nakba or the hijab. Real ghoul and war criminal, where he would basically run over people with his truck. Northern Afghans, or people that would be affiliated with Masood or Rashid Datsun. And Chris Fitzgerald, no relation to me, wrote an opinion piece on the South China Morning Post, which I thought was good. And it basically talked about, and I'll just make myself disappear so you can see it. The Taliban's failures have left Afghanistan in the grip of terrorism again. This is actually a really good article. I'm going to link it in the description for you to read it. And it basically talks about what this left was a vacuum, just like Iraq, similar. When the United States basically liquidated the police under the Iraqi Provisional Order number 1, and then Iraqi Provisional Order number 2, which liquidated the police and the military, which led to anarchy. And because there was a Sunni and Shia divide in the country, this led to elections later on, in which a Shia president, Nur Malki, created a civil war. It was a war on the Sunnis. And what happened was Al Qaeda under bin Laden saw this as a great segue to bring about groups that were training in these training camps in Afghanistan. One being Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was a Jordanian pimp and murderer who was given money by bin Laden to open a training camp in Iraq. And this group, which basically was called Wild Jihad al-Jihad, which was based in Jordan, which wasn't a very big group, later became Al Qaeda in Iraq, and then renamed to the Islamic State in Iraq. And when this group basically left Iraq because the United States killed its leader, Zarqawi, the remnants of that group went to Syria, which incidentally was under the Arab Spring, which some say was CIA influenced, basically gave rise to the Sunni extremist group and to the remnants of this group, which is now led by under the group's leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, which later became the Islamic State and Levant, because this small group from Iraq went to Syria and became a regional force. How? CIA money. Now, in the article, it basically states that when the United States left Afghanistan in 2021, Taliban took over. However, there was a group there called the Islamic State and Khorasan. Now, you probably never heard of it. The group was created in January 2015 by disaffected Taliban in eastern Afghanistan. Yeah, there's disaffected Taliban factions. Like I said, one thing about the Afghan people is that they're very sectarian, fractious. They'll switch sides. And according to its membership includes the individuals from various countries. And just like the Islamic State, they're foreign Arabs, not homegrown. So you got, these people from Pakistan and Bangladesh and Myanmar, India, right, who are basically just foreign Arabs, basically persuading members of the Taliban who are disaffected with the Taliban in Afghanistan. And this is basically where theology comes in, this Wahhabi principle. Now, Wahhabism is much different than, say, Hanafi. Hanafi is what the school of law that the Taliban go by. And I don't have time to basically talk about all this because I'm trying to condense it. Now, Wahhabism and Hanafi are two different schools of law. Wahhabism is much more puritanical and much more apt to kill like Shia, whereas Hanafis are not. Hanafis are traditional, predates Wahhabism. So it's just basically a clash of cultures. And basically what happened was right around 2014, the Islamic State basically sent representatives to Pakistan to meet with the local militants from the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, or the TTP, which is a huge faction. Some say this is a creation of the ISI, the Pakistan ISI. Now, following like weeks and months of discussions, there was propaganda, leaflets, and flags from the Islamic State being distributed in parts of Pakistan, written in the languages of Dari or Pashto, which is what Afghans speak, including a call to swear their allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, which is similar to calling, to swear your loyalty to bin Laden, which is bayat, meaning swearing an oath, fealty. Same thing with the Islamic State. So they have similar properties, even though they too are different. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi needs to have anybody that's situated or swore or to join Islamic State to swear bayat, loyalty to him. And some of the members of the TTP, I think it was like 12 of them, which is, 10 or 12 of these people actually switched sides, which created a factional divide between the TTP and the Islamic State. And basically what happened was members of the TTP and Islamic State then went to Afghanistan and created the group, the Islamic State Khorasan Province. That's the name of the group. ISIS-K, ISIS Islamic State /K Khorasan. They made a video in January 2015 swearing their allegiance to Baghdadi. And the leader of this group would be Hafiz Saeed Khan. He would be later killed in a U.S. airstrike in 2016. Now, 2 years later, fast forward 2 years later, the group gets a little bit bigger. Their propaganda is much more proficient than the Taliban's. That's the one thing Islamic State learned from Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda was the best Islamic terrorist network in regards to propaganda using video, internet to make recruits. Islamic State saw this and learned from this, and basically you saw this as the future. And so the Taliban were very traditional. Remember, they don't like the internet, TV, or radio. So this is not going to help with them. So the Islamic State and Al Qaeda basically use this to their advantage. Now, when this happened, it basically created a huge sectarian divide in the country. And with the United States leaving behind millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons, which was conveniently left behind, which basically I saw it as, we're going to arm the Taliban because if the Cold War doesn't work in China, in Russia, or Iran, we're going back to the war on terrorism and fight against the Taliban. And it always so there's always a reciprocating war here. Like Orwell said in 1984, war was never meant to be won. It was meant to be continuous. One thing about the United States, they're very shrewd, especially foreign policy analysts. They don't think like me and you. We're worried about right now. They're worried about 5, 10, 20 years down the road. They play the long run game. They don't have worries like us. How to make the rent, how to get your children fed. What if I lose my job? I'm teetering on bankruptcy, divorce, all these things. We have time to worry about what's going on under our name in Afghanistan. And these why these problems persist. So foreign policy analysts basically see long run game. How much life could this cost? Armaments, how many were going to be needed? How much money is needed for groups to basically overthrow this government? Can we use the CIA or the DIA to basically institute a coup here? And, this is what they think about all day long. They don't care about human life. They care about themselves, not the poor. This is a class warfare. This is racial warfare. This is religious warfare. This is an ideology warfare. This is human warfare. They only care about themselves, not us. They don't care about, even if they don't care about us, what do you think they care about in Afghanistan or China, or Russia? Just look at your own backyard. Look how the government treats us. Imagine how they treat everybody else. That's why they can easily slaughter millions of people without any recompense, without even worry of any responsibility from the judicial sector or from the international criminal courts. They don't care about responsibility. I'm not talking about the military, not blaming them. I'm blaming people in the State Department at the Pentagon and foreign lobbyists that only care about their own. And so when you have this factor of the U.S. leaving behind millions and millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of weapons for the Taliban that are basically now using those weapons, selling those weapons to Ukraine. There's an article by foreignpolicy.com. Selling in the black market. This is on purpose so that conflicts can exist everywhere. There's no conflict. There's no profits being made for Boeing or Raytheon or LG3 Technologies. None of these, Halliburton, none of these corporations could basically pay their workers to continue making military-grade weapons. Keep that factory line moving. Now, when it comes to foreign policy analysts, they know exactly what they're doing. Creating enemies when there doesn't need to be. Making sure that sectarian divide continues. So this way our enemy doesn't grow too big. And that's why groups like ISIS-K and Taliban are clashing with each other. Now, according to the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, which is the UNAMA, since 2021, since the United States left, there 1,095 civilians were killed, including 287 children, and 2,679 people wounded when the Taliban took over. And most of the casualties, according to the article, were results of improvised explosive devices, IEDs, in populated areas like mosques, markets, and schools. The United States has a huge responsibility here to answer for the failures of Afghanistan. Now, unfortunately, these attacks by Islamic State in Khorasan, the Taliban, are just a daily part of life in Afghanistan. And in the article, it talks about this suicide bombing that happened in September of 2022 that killed 35 people in an education center in Kabul. Which was a classroom bombing death. Twenty of those people that were killed were young girls and women. And with the civilian casualty rate up to about 8 to 10,000 since 2021, it's actually changing the dynamics of the country into a pre-9/11 Afghanistan that we saw under Mohammed Mullah Omar in 1996. Now, how long is this going to last? Well, as long as the United States continues to ignore what's going on in Afghanistan, I'm not saying it's a hard question. I'm not saying that the U.S. military has to get involved again. There has to be some regulations here. Can we liquidate the Taliban? We can. But we'll also have to account for Pakistan. Now, Pakistan is the primary center for all Taliban, for majority of Taliban activity. Their creation of the ISI. So they're funded. I mean, you got groups like the Haqqani Network, Tehrik-i-Taliban, that basically are somewhat supported by the ISI covertly. And so it's not as simple as just going in there, eliminating Taliban. We could have under Operation Jawbreaker, which we were close to. But that operation ended because the State Department wanted to replace the commander of Operation Jawbreaker, Gary Bernstein, with another CIA official, Richard Blee. Now, if you recognize that name, he was the station chief at Alex Station, the Bin Laden issue station. And why did he replace Gary Bernstein? So that he wouldn't be investigated by the 9/11 Commission about the CIA program that was monitoring and assisting 2 9/11 hijackers inside the United States with the Saudis. And they didn't inform the FBI. They didn't inform the State Department. So Richard Blee, with another analyst, Michelle and Casey, they went to Afghanistan and took over the program. Bin Laden escapes, goes to Afghanistan. It goes into Pakistan, Waziristan, and basically regroups Al Qaeda. And they live on for another 10 years. Taliban, well, they basically continued on. And with them at the teetering of destruction. And so this is what's happening now. So now we have the Islamic State in Khorasan and the Taliban fighting each other currently, right now. The Islamic State in Khorasan has now gained a greater foothold of targeting the Hazaras, the Shia, the Sufi. These are all minority groups. And they have been the most aggressive, even toward the United States in 2021 when they bombed the airport. Remember that? They bombed the airport. And so they, they are basically worse than the Taliban. So the Taliban notices, and that's why they've been at odds. And now we have Al Qaeda. Don't forget about them. They're still in Afghanistan, not as big as they used to be, but they're given protection because Al Qaeda is at war with Islamic State. And this was back in 2011, where the Al Qaeda disassociated from the Islamic State because the Islamic State were killing Sufis in Syria. And Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri basically wrote a letter to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi telling him not to continue this because it hurts us. And they disassociated from Al Qaeda. And so what happened was that here you have basically a group that is killing Sufi and Shia and is at war with a Hanafi school of law, Taliban, and then Al Qaeda gets involved. And now what do you have? You have three very extremist ideologies, because all three are different from each other in property, in terms of culture and religious differences, fighting for control of the country. And who's in between? The Afghan people. That's who the United States failed. And they continue to fail because these are people who wanted help. And the U.S. left them with nothing, because not only was it a failure of the U.S., but it was a failure of the Afghan government. You can't change a culture, and you can't change a people, and you can't force democracy. And this is a prime example of that. And the people are always the victim of every war, of every conflict. And they're often forgotten about, because all we remember are the headlines in the papers about how this government failed, or this government's great, or this group, extremist group, is conducting operations, or this extremist group is getting funding from the intelligence services, foreign and domestic. And we're basically concentrating on that, but we're not concentrating on the pleas and the cries of the people. We see it in Ukraine. We see it in Afghanistan. We see it in Iraq. We see it in Syria. We see it in Libya. And who are the antagonists? It's not just the United States. It's also the terrorist groups, the intelligence services. And these are all the people that have no affiliation with the common folk like you and me and you. The United States government has one thing that they're experts at: apathy. They know nothing about the human condition. Empathy. It's the one thing we have which is indisposable on our side. And if we could find it within us to basically have that empathy spread about the American populace and stop this divisional fighting, sectarian fighting, even within our own country, whether it's sexism or religion or racism or politics. None of those matter. If we ever to basically empathize with each other, we could change the world. We could change what's happening. We can make that change. But we can't do it if we're disorganized and if we're disenfranchised and worried about what's happening right now with our own lives. So we need to better ourselves in order to better the world and make that change happen, or else wars like what we're seeing in Afghanistan will continue to exist. All right, guys, have a good rest of your day. I'll see you in the next video. Take care.